Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, peptides and the FDA. I'm joined by a familiar voice, Dr. Josh Sharfstein, who in this episode wears his hat as a former FDA official to talk with me about the recent advisory panel discussion on peptides and what happens next. Let's listen. Dr. Josh Sharfstein, welcome to Public Health on Call.
Good to see you, Lindsay.
It's good to see you too. So you're joining us today as my co-host, but more importantly, in your capacity as someone who has worked for the FDA, because we're talking about peptides. And right now, this is an FDA conversation. But just to back up a little bit, can you tell us what are peptides? What are they used for? How do people get them?
Sure. There's been a lot of news about an advisory committee meeting that just happened at the Food and Drug Administration about a number of peptides. Peptides are basically strings of amino acids. They're parts of proteins. Insulin is a peptide. GLP-1s are peptides. So some of them are very well known to medicine and very well studied. But they're a bunch of amino acids, and you can string them together in all kinds of different ways. And so there are other peptides that people are wondering or they think might be helpful to people for different uses, but they haven't been as well studied. And so this conversation is about a set of peptides that are not approved, have not been well studied, and the FDA and in general, the government, all of us are thinking about what to do with them.
Why haven't they been well studied? Are they just new?
Well, that's a good question. It's not so much a question for me because, I think they should be well studied. It might be a question for the people who are selling them in part. If you think it works, why not do a study and prove that it works, which is the usual route for drugs to reach the market. It's also the question for FDA because FDA can stop people from selling products that are unproven if they are drugs. And FDA does do that. And in fact, FDA has done that for some peptides. So really what's happening here is the FDA is deciding, or the government is deciding whether or not these products do need to be studied before they're legally available.
And so if they're not legally available right now, how are people getting peptides?
Again, we're just talking about those peptides that aren't approved. They can get them by going online and ordering them, and then people are essentially selling them against the law. Now, sometimes the companies try to avoid that by writing on the package for research use only, but that really doesn't get them out of the legal requirement. So basically, these are products that right now, many of them are being sold illegally, I should say, but there's a strong interest in that community for them to be able to be sold legally and for people just to be able to go online and click and buy them.
And that was kind of my next question is how did this get to be on the FDA's agenda as something that they should be looking at?
So this all falls under pharmaceutical compounding. Nobody is saying that these unproven products should suddenly be designated like drugs, like insulin or GLP-1s. To be approved fully as a drug, there's a lot of research that has to go into it. There are a lot of requirements that then apply for safe manufacturing, for adverse event reporting. This conversation is about none of that. This has to do with compounding, which is a way that pharmacies can make products and sell them, in some cases, even if that product has not gone through the review process. Typically, pharmacy compounding is for a substance that has gone through the review process, but the pharmacy is making it in a different form. A classic example would be there's a child who can't swallow pills. You go to the pharmacy, they compound it into a liquid. And it's about the same drug that the FDA actually did see all the data about. This is about products, peptides that have not been thoroughly reviewed. And the law does give a little bit of a sliver for FDA to permit those to be sold. That is not the same as a determination of safety and effectiveness. It's sort of permission to be sold. And there's a list that the FDA can put those products on. Again, this is just a permission list. It's not the safe and effective list, but that's what they were looking at this advisory committee. Should these be allowed to be sold? So this raises questions of law, but also questions of policy, like, should we just allow people to sell peptides?
Do we have a lot of information about whether they're safe and effective?
Well, that was the focus of the advisory committee. The Food and Drug Administration staff, expert scientists who review products, thought that was no. They thought the answer to that was no. They pointed out that there may be a little study here or there. There are also some evidence of concern. And their view is like, look, we're open to approving a peptide, but you got to do the research. Just giving permission to sell, there's not a basis, and there actually could be harm. Of course, other people stood up and said, all we need is a little bit of evidence to make it available and give people the chance. If they think it works for them, what's the harm?
So let's talk about this particular FDA panel. What did it look like? Who was on it?
So under the law, before the agency can put a product on this permission list for compounding, they have to go to an advisory committee. And so the FDA took these peptides to an advisory committee. The staff provided their recommendation against authorizing this to the panel, but the panel largely voted in favor of them. But it wasn't the previous standing panel. There were a bunch of people who were added, including people with very strong ties to the peptide world, including people who actually sold peptides for, as part of their income. And so I think it'd be fair to say the advisory committee membership has been heavily criticized as having significant conflicts of interest. And in fact, the votes were all close, pretty much tracked whether people had those conflicts of interest. The people who did voted, sure, let's give people permission to access these peptides. And the people who didn't said things like, I'm very worried about what this could mean for people because the evidence is not there.
The question that popped into my mind was, how is this allowed? How are you allowed to sit on a committee like this when you have such a clear conflict of interest?
So it's an interesting question. And I don't know that the Department of Health and Human Services has really walked through why they think this meets the requirements of the ethics law. In general, people who have direct financial conflicts of interest cannot serve on advisory committees without a very explicit waiver. I don't know whether waivers were given. I don't know what the legal analysis was. But separate from the legal question you're asking, is it allowed? There's a policy question, is it a good idea? And I would say people who have that kind of conflict of interest generally shouldn't be on committees like this.
Well, and so this committee convened and they voted. So what happens next?
So again, the FDA staff advised against it. There were contested close votes on those different topics. One of them didn't even make it past that vote. And then it will go back to FDA. FDA will have to decide whether to add these products to this list of permissible compounded products, and also how to do that, whether it will have to go through a regulatory process or whether they'll just, announce it and hope that that counts. It's clear that there are people, the senior leadership of the Department of Health and Human Services, who are of the view that people get benefit from this. They feel like they get benefit. And in general, unless there's a really strong reason, otherwise, they should have access to it. And I think that kind of policy thinking might lead the FDA and HHS to agree to make some of these more widely available.
Do you think that this would pave the way for other peptides, or would they have to go through a similar process?
Other peptides would have to go through a similar process, but I bet there'd be a line of them because there a lot of things online about what people are claiming. I do think it's important to take a step back and say, in the food and drug law, there are really two different conceptions of products. There are products that really treat illness. And those products are generally pharmaceuticals and devices, and they have pretty strict evidentiary requirements, particularly medications, for studies that demonstrate safety and effectiveness. Then there are products that aren't quite like that. Dietary supplements come to mind. Dietary supplements don't require a pre-market review for safety and effectiveness. There are some types of requirements for how they're manufactured. There's certain products that are not allowed to be dietary supplements. But generally speaking, they make different kinds of claims. They say things like boosts immune function. They don't say treats infection. And the general theory behind those products is not safe and effective. It's basically access with safety. And when you look at surveys of the American people, by 80% of them think that it's really important the FDA make sure that they're safe. But another 80% will turn around and say, I don't think it's that important to hear from the FDA that it works. I'll be the judge of that. So this idea that there are certain products that aren't like the ones that are supposed to be for treating cancer or serious illnesses, those products, we have a framework for greater access with safety requirements. And so you're getting a little bit of that theme in the discussion of peptides. The issue, though, is that there are differences. The two biggest differences are, number one, some of these peptides really do claim to treat diseases, and people take them for particular medical purposes. So that would blur the line a lot with dietary supplements, which are not marketed for that purpose. The second thing is there is an entire framework for the safety of dietary supplements that doesn't exist for peptides. So dietary supplements, there have to be reports of adverse events. There have to be inspections of the facilities. None of those things exist for peptides. So by putting it on this list, it's just making it available, but it's not taking other steps to protect people in the public. All that's handled at the state level by 50 different states. And in fact, at the meeting, one of the FDA officials said something to the effect of, we can't add other requirements under the law. This is just permission to compound.
So in your mind, going back, if you were still the former principal deputy commissioner of the FDA, what should a process have looked like? Someone brings peptides to the FDA and says, we want to make these available. We want to go through the proper channels. What would that process look like?
Well, the FDA did do a process. They did a big public comment period. They asked people to send in evidence, not just for whether the peptides work, but also their use in medicine. Is this something that people are really relying on? Have relied on it for some time. For some reason, nobody's making it right now, but we really need it in medicine. So they got comments and they came up with a list and basically said anything else should have a very high bar. And so, that I think was a pretty reasonable approach to this. And it is very reasonable to study these conditions. If people think that there's a peptide that you take to bounce back from a muscle injury, well, you can give it to people with muscle injuries. You can design a good study for that and see whether it works. So I think the idea isn't to keep peptides away from people. The idea is to know which peptides work and which are safe so that people ultimately can make good decisions based on good information.
Do you see any of those studies out there right now?
Well, it's hard to know exactly what studies are out there, but I think there's a very serious concern, which I share, which is if you just give permission to market them, that sound you hear is all the enthusiasm for doing studies zipping out the window. Like if you can sell and make money and you can make claims and the FDA is going to allow you to do that, there really isn't a great reason to go out and do a study that could undermine everything you're telling people.
What else do people need to know right now about peptides?
I'd start with putting a substance with unknown risks and benefits into your body is a risky proposition. And I certainly think that the most important thing is to talk to a clinician, a doctor, a nurse, if you're thinking about it, and generally see if there are products that can address your concerns that have good evidence behind them first.
I see a lot of ads for peptides, and even for me, it's difficult sometimes. It looks like if I click on this ad, I might be actually connected to a medical professional that can talk me through which peptide is best for me. So how can people kind of see through the noise a little bit and, who is the right person to talk to about this?
Yeah, that's a great point. I would not go to a medical professional linked to a website that is selling peptides, particularly unapproved peptides we're talking about here. I don't think that's a good way to get medical advice. I think it's good for people to talk to their own doctor, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, someone they trust, that you have questions about it. But from my perspective, it's just not a good idea to take unproven products. And it's way better for all of us to turn to the people who are making a lot of money selling these and say, use that money right now, do studies, let us know what works. And believe me, the market will reward products that work. But if you approve everything, then we'll never know what works, what doesn't, what's safe, what isn't. And I think ultimately patients will lose.
Dr. Josh Sharfstein, thanks for joining us on Public Health on Call.
Lindsay, I think you know where to find me. Thanks for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Rachel Walsh. Audio production by Michael Bonfils, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from J.B. Arbogast, Spencer Greer, and Chip Hickey. Distribution and social media by Rachel Walsh, with support from Nick Moran and Brianna Iacovelli. Follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky at Public Health Pod for more public health takes and special content. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.